Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at the image of God with Dr. Carmen McDowell, professor of Old Testament from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and the author of The Image of God in the Garden of Eden. Dr. McDowell, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a treat.
All righty. So first of all, could you review for us, before we even get into Scripture or the ancient Near East, could you review for us schools of thought about the image of God throughout church history?
Speaking in very broad brushstrokes, when you look at the history of interpretation of what does it mean to be made in God's image in Genesis 1, four primary categories kind of rise to the surface. One being that humanity being made in God's image refers to a mental and or spiritual likeness, meaning that, for example, humans have rational capacity, and that must be somehow related to being made in God's image. It's a view that disputes that there would be anything physical, but primarily there's some kind of the spiritual capacity that we have is a big part of what it means to be made in God's image. Another view is quite distinct from that, and we see it in rabbinic theology, that it actually is something physical. And in rabbinic theology, there's a stream of thought that God has a body, and that's why humans have a body. This may sound very surprising to our audience, but because it's not something that Christians typically think of, this kind of physical resemblance. But I do find it interesting and sometimes ask myself, I haven't studied it in any depth yet, but this idea, Jesus had a physical body. And so do we look like we do? Is our physical being somehow a reflection of Christ's physical being? Anyway, for another time. But that's an idea in rabbinic theology that God had a body, and so being made in the image and likeness of God is reflected in our physical body. There's also the idea that humanity function as God's counterparts, and this is something that Karl Barth was famous for, and he defines it in terms in relation to the Trinity. So that there is as there is relationship within the Trinity, that being created in God's image and likeness is primarily about relationship between God and humanity. And so being made in the image of God is primarily about a spiritual relationship. And we see that further developed in his writings. But one that probably is most prominent among Old Testament scholars is the view that humans are being made in God's image means that humanity is created as a royal representative of God on earth. And of course, this view arises right out of the context of Genesis 1. Humanity is said God commands them to rule and subdue and to procreate, be fruitful, multiply. And so this view is not something you typically find in the church. I don't hear it preached very often, but it's definitely a prevailing view among Old Testament scholars. And that derives primarily from the ancient Near Eastern context of Genesis 1.
Alrighty, so let's take a look at the ancient Near East. Assyria, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, what can we learn from their experience, writings, archaeology, etc.?
Yeah, it's again, it's not something that we typically consider if we're in a Bible study or hearing a sermon or preaching a sermon. But the historical context and the ancient Near context is vital to understanding the Old Testament. And so with this kind of as a case study, we see the image and likeness language elsewhere in we call it the ancient Near East. We mean the wider world of the Bible, Israel's neighbors, Israel's cultural context, right? Historical context. And we see this language being used. One way it's used, of course, is to denote an idol, what we would call an idol, what the Bible calls an idol, what they would have called a statue or a god, actually. And so I do think that one of the things we glean from looking at the ancient Near Eastern context when it comes to interpreting Genesis 1 is that humanity is, when we say royal representative, is almost like God's statuette on earth. Okay, this physical representative in some way of God's character, of God's capacity to rule. Like we have a capacity to rule because God's given us that, and to subdue in the way that God would rule and subdue, not to damage the earth, of course, but to rule and subdue in the way that he rules and subdues. So one aspect is this royal, kingly aspect, but also it seems to indicate by using this image and likeness language that was quite common in the wider world of the Old Testament, to indicate a statue, some kind of physical manifestation or representation of the God, in this case of God himself. One of the other really interesting things that pops up, though, is when you look at image and likeness language in several creation stories from the ancient world, that it's used to designate the father-son relationship, parent-child. But I think in all the examples, it's except one, it's father-son, and then an Egyptian example, it's God and the God and humanity. But it does define. It says so-and-so was made in the image and likeness of his father. And we see that in, for example, what's often known as the Babylonian Genesis, the Enuma Elish, as it's called. And there, it's talking about the birth of all these gods, and they're compared to their parent. And so one is made in the image and likeness of his father. And it's very similar terminology to what we get in Genesis 1. So it's important that we read Genesis 1 in that original historical context, because we need to ask ourselves, how would ancient Israel have heard this? When they heard it or read it for the first time, what came to their mind when they heard image and likeness? And my guess is it was both sonship, so God defining the divine human relationship in terms of father-son, which, sonship is a big, carries a lot of theological freight in the Old Testament, and in terms of this royal representative kind of quality that humanity has.
Could you give us a little more detail about specific examples in the ancient Near East that would be helpful for getting this background to the Old Testament?
Sure. So the Enuma Elish being one of them, right? There is an Egyptian text, the text of Merikare, and that one mentions humanity as the image and likeness of the God. And it's interesting because there, the word for image actually has, it's clearly denoted in Egyptian that it's referring to a statue. Yeah, it's got a little marker beside the word that indicates it's talking about a statue. So there it's both, and it talks about father. I mean, the God having fathered them. So it's a combination of the sonship and the statue idea. We have another one it's called it's a hymn of an Assyrian king named Tukulti-Ninurta, and the third. And it's a hymn that talks about his birth. And it says that he was cast through the channel of the womb of the gods. So it's employing that kind of metallurgy imagery. He's being cast and poured like a metal statue. But Enlil, who's this patron deity, is his father in the poem. Enlil is named as his father. And it even says that this king, Tukulti-Ninurta, is the image of Enlil. So he's both the physical statue representing Enlil, but a living being, of course, a king, a real human person. And he's the son of this God. And it's a poem, it's a hymn, it's not a historical narrative, but it's fascinating to me that that's another example where we have a combination of sonship, or father-son, image and likeness language being used for that, but also clearly being used to talk about the king as a physical representation of the deity.
All right, so that gives us a good background for diving into the Old Testament. So what can you tell us in the Old Testament, especially, of course, in first couple chapters of Genesis, but go for it.
Yeah. So what does the Bible have to say? So we've looked at the ancient Near Eastern context a little bit, but what does the Bible have to say about image and likeness language? Well, interestingly, this pair of terms occurs one other place in the Old Testament, and it's together, and it's in Genesis 5, 1-3, where it talks about Adam fathering Seth. And it says that Seth was made in the image and likeness of Adam, just as Adam was made in the image and likeness of God. And so again, there we have a witness from the Bible itself, from just a few chapters after Genesis 1. It's clearly referring back to Genesis 1, 26-28, 27. And it is also combining image and likeness language with sonship. I mean, it basically gives us the biblical definition of image and likeness. It's father-son relationship. So the son is made in the image and likeness of the father.
Okay, and to be clear, are we to understand image and likeness as synonymous, or is there some variation there?
Yeah, good question. There's some debate about that, but I do think that they're largely synonymous, and based on the fact that there are several other words in related Semitic languages like Akkadian for image and likeness that we see used in this way as well. And there's one particular inscription on a statue that was discovered in Syria that dates, I believe it's about 9th century BC. And it actually has a bilingual inscription on the statue. And it's in Akkadian and Aramaic. And make sure I get them straight. I believe the Aramaic has image and likeness, just like the cognate terms that we have in Genesis 1, Tselem and Demut, image and likeness. But the Akkadian translation of that uses image both times, uses the term Tselem. It's all Akkadian, but Tselem both times. So at least the scribe in that case apparently saw them as synonymous. There is some debate in Genesis 1, but I do think they're probably roughly synonymous. Yeah.
Okay, so you go for more examples in the Old Testament. Also, you talk in Genesis 9 about the blood avenger, and also the notion of the prohibition of graven images.
Yes. So good. Genesis 9, we don't have image and likeness there, but we do have image. And it's clearly referring back to Genesis 1. So it says that this is the kind of the death penalty in the Old Testament, that you can't, if you take the life of someone, then you pay with your own life. And the reason given there is because humanity is made in the image and likeness of God. And interestingly, in some of our English Bibles, it's translated as that the reason is given at the end of that clause, but in Hebrew, it's at the beginning. It's in the, why do you get the death penalty for murder? Because in the image and likeness of God, God made humanity. So it's actually written in Hebrew to emphasize that the reason that you don't kill someone is because they are made in the image and likeness of God. And that emphasis is lost in some English Bibles when they flip the order. But again, what's so interesting about this, if indeed the image language is kinship language, what does it mean? I mean, why would God say in Genesis 9, if you take the life of another person, then your life's going to be forfeit? Because they're made in God's image and likeness, meaning that this is God's child that someone has killed. And we have this very interesting concept in the Old Testament of a lot of people are familiar with it. We talk about the kinsman redeemer, like from the book of Ruth. Boaz turns out to be the kinsman redeemer. But the word is really just, it means kind of to act as a kinsman, act as a redeemer. And one of the roles of the kinsman redeemer is to avenge the life of your murdered family member. And so it seems to be in Genesis 9, this seems to be another confirmation that image and likeness language is really about kinship, is because God says, if you murder one of my family members, then you pay with your life. Like God is going to act as the divine kinsman or the kinsman redeemer and carry out that specific role of the blood avenger, the family avenger. So it does seem to support this idea that image and likeness language is really primarily about kinship.
And then the prohibition against graven images, why is that significant?
Why is it that Israel's told very clearly, you are not to make images? I think there are probably several reasons. And probably the most popular one, most common interpretation is that God simply can't be captured in anything that a human being could make, which is true. But I think it's also that he's the only one that is permitted to make images of himself. And he does so in the form of humanity, right? Not that we're divine, we're not gods, but we are in some way representatives of God, as flawed as we are, representatives of God on earth. And so, he's the only one who is what I would call the legitimate image maker.
All right. And in Leviticus 19 and other places, there's laws relating to justice. And you talk about the notion of Israel being created to be a display people of God, and doing acts of justice has everything to do with that.
Yes.
In order that the nations are drawn to God.
Yes. So the functional aspect of being made in God's image and likeness is well developed in a lot of the secondary literature, like commentaries, things like that, the royal function of humanity. And so in Israel's context, what did it actually look like for them to carry out this kind of this role as God's representative? If we back up just a little bit, when God delivers Israel out of Egypt, remember what he says to Pharaoh. He says to Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go, right? They're identified as God's people. But he even says, with the plague on the death of the firstborn, that he's going to take, because his firstborn, Israel, has been so badly abused, he's going to cause the death of the firstborn of Egypt. And so explicitly, the term for son, S-O-N, is used explicitly of Israel in the book of Exodus. And so a lot of folks will trace sonship back to Exodus, but I think it actually goes all the way back to Genesis 1. And Israel becomes kind of this subset of humanity whom God chooses, almost like a second Adam or a second Adam or a second humanity, through whom he's going to achieve his redemptive ends. Because the first Adam and the first Eve failed so miserably. And rather than destroy them, God continues he sets out a plan to restore the world. And through a descendant of Israel he's going to do this. But so Israel is explicitly his son. The term is used there for the whole nation of Israel. And they get this call in Exodus 19. God says, if you are going to, that you will be my special treasured possession, if you will obey the covenant, and you will be to me as a royal priesthood and a holy nation. So there we get this royal priestly language, again, applied to Israel this time. But I think it's a kind of a revival of God's original creational intent for all of humanity, but it's now focused specifically on Israel, through whom God will achieve his purposes to restore humanity to himself. So I digress. I'm getting off a little bit, but you asked me about Leviticus. So what did it look like for Israel to live in their own context as faithful son, as a light to the nations, as Isaiah calls it, to live before the watching eyes of the nations in such a way that they will display the character of the Father to those people who don't know him. And so Leviticus 19 captures this very well. It talks about what it means to be holy, like God is holy. And when I was growing up, I always thought of holiness as something that was kind of unappealing. It sounded, you couldn't have any fun. You had to sit and, I don't know, I just had a very misguided perception of what holiness meant. But Leviticus 19 helps us see what does it look like for Israel to live a holy life and thus display the character of God. It meant things like when you're harvesting, if you're someone who grows grapes, or you would harvest, but leave plenty on the edges for those who are poor, for the widows, or for the foreigner in your midst. So it was a way to remind the landowner that God is actually the ultimate landowner, that your land is on loan from God. This is God's land. So it would keep the landowner from becoming greedy and hard of heart, but it was also a way not only for the poor to provide for themselves, but also it gave them a way to tithe and to participate in worship. So it was a dignifying process for everyone involved. And then, of course, using just weights and measures, right? Don't cheat people who are buying wheat from you or grain. Use weights and measures that are accurate. Why? What does that have to do with being created in the image of God? Because it's a faithful, truthful representation, right? If your weights are accurate, then you are being fair, right? You're not cheating someone. And there's also, it talks about don't move the boundary stone. Well, there were stones that were laid out to indicate, property lines. And by moving it to try to enlarge your territory, you were then stealing from someone, right? Stealing part of their land. And so if you're to embody what it meant to live as one created in God's image would again, justice, fairness, truthfulness are all aspects of that. The opposite being, deceit and wickedness and those kind of things. So it has extremely practical implications, both for Israel and for us. But yeah, I don't know what could be more practical, to be honest.
All right. And going back to Genesis, we see the whole notion of being made in the image and likeness of God, right in the same context of be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth, have dominion. How would you tie in image of God with those three mandates?
Yeah, good. I think they are the implications of, so one who's made in the image of God, that is, in quotes, kind of sons, children, and of course, children of God, that's a big theme in the New Testament. But I would say that this is the function, the royal function of those made in God's image, of humanity. And so this plays itself out in the way that God's people should be ruling and subduing in ways that imitate ways that display God's character. So again, justice, not greed, right? Fairness, and things like, being fruitful and multiplying. God is providing humanity with a way to create, almost in a sense, images of their own, right? They're part of God's family, but in a way, it's imitating God, right? To be fruitful, to be creative, to be productive, in a way that blesses the nations, or the way that blesses humanity. And so God's not giving them permission. We say subdue in modern English. That sometimes has a negative connotation, but it certainly didn't in biblical Hebrew, and not in Genesis 1. It's about ruling in a way that really cares for, promotes, causes God's creation and people to thrive. So again, the particular applications are kind of innumerable.
And how would you tie in theophanies to the image of God?
Theophanies, in terms of, there are, there are places where God appears not in human form, right? In the Old Testament, he appears as cloud, or in the cloud, or as a pillar in fire, like at the burning bush, of course, through the Red Sea. But there are places, interestingly enough, where he appears, and the prophets, for example, like Ezekiel, describe it as like a man, right? Like a human. He's seated on a throne, or they describe God in anthropomorphic terms. And again, some folks just conclude that this is simply a way to just, either it's a poetic way or kind of a metaphorical way to describe God. They think there's no way God could have that kind of physicality. And maybe they're right. But I do wonder that, again, if we kind of look at it from the other side, why do we look the way we do? Why were we created? Our heads up here, we have two arms, we have two legs. Like, is there anything that we are patterned after? Is there any particular manifestation of God whom we are patterned after physically? And again, this is all kind of just surmising or just wondering really about this. But of course, Jesus was manifest as a human, right? And who looked like one of us. And so, it does beg the question, is that the pattern? This anthropomorphic form of God, is that a pattern after which we were created? Because most people tend to look at it as God took on human form because we're humans and he's kind of condescending to us. But it just makes me wonder, because someone asked me the question once and I thought, I really should think about that. So I don't have a conclusion, but I think it's a fascinating question. Are we patterned after an anthropomorphic manifestation of God himself? I don't know.
All righty. Well, so let's dive into the New Testament. We've got Paul using the language of image of God in Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, and then James. Yep. So what would you tell us about the image of God in the New Testament?
Yeah.
Especially as it relates to Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. So I think here the sonship aspect really comes to the fore, because Jesus himself is declared to be not like the image. See, in Genesis 1, humans are created in the likeness and in the image and according to the likeness. But with Jesus, there are no prepositions when he's described. He is the image. He is the likeness. In other words, he is the son, right? So I think the sonship comes to the fore there, because again, explicitly, Jesus is described as the Son of God in the New Testament, but also that he's a manifestation of God himself. So he's not just a representative, but he actually manifests God in some amazing, mind-blowing way. He exhibits the character of God, the wisdom of God. So he is like the ultimate, like he's defined as the second Adam. He's the firstborn of the new creation. Like he is the first of new humanity, right? And so I do think it's not just sonship, but I think sonship is a key part of what it means that Jesus was the image and likeness of God. He is God's son, but he is this manifestation of God who exhibits perfectly God's holiness, God's character, God's wisdom, and in his behavior, in his treatment, in his treatment of other people, in his words, he fully and perfectly displays the identity of God, the character of God. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that he's not just made in God's image, he actually is the image.
We started with historical views on the image of God in the church and how they, according to most scholars now, I guess since for some time now, quite a few decades, see those as insufficient. Yet, as you mentioned, many pastors, many people in the church still hold on to views which are less than biblical. They're not historically grounded.
Right.
So is that a problem, or is that just inconsequential? Because it seems like that could have harmful effects on the church because of that. What do you think?
Yeah, you're right that this kind of, at least the royal representative view has been around for a long time. I mean, it goes at least back to the early 1900s with some European scholars. And that came about because of the rediscovery of the ancient Near Eastern world, right? So for centuries, church scholars and church folk, they didn't have access to that information, but now we do. And I think, I do ask myself, why has this not made its way into the church? Because it's in the major commentaries. I don't know if this is the case, but I just have to pose the question: how much are we studying when we prepare? If we're teaching a Bible study or a sermon, or preaching a sermon, teaching a class, how much preparation are we actually doing? Because I don't think the information is hidden. But I do think that the way I tend to compare it is, there's so much richness. If you just pay attention to the context, the original context, there's so much richness there that if you're the teacher or the preacher, you're denying people. Or again, it's not just on the preacher and teacher. We can study for ourselves too, that if you're not at least consulting a good commentary or a good study Bible, there are some study Bibles out now that really focus on historical context. There's the NIV has one and the ESV has one, and they're both very good. And so you don't have to go digging in all these different books. They'll provide it for you right in the notes. But it does, it just grieves me that people aren't getting what is there on offer, that they're kind of getting a bag of potato chips when what's really being offered is a full course, delicious, nutritious meal. And so I think that's where the harm comes. People get superficial and often erroneous understanding. Because if you just ask people, I've done this before, taking informal polls of, well, what do you think it means to be made in God's image? And usually people talk about our creative abilities, and some people mention relationship. And I think, those are true, but it's just scratching the surface. And in the context, in lay context, where I've been able to talk about image of God in more depth, people are amazed. And it really is something, it's not just an intellectual kind of adventure, it's really transformative. It changes how we relate to each other and how we perceive other people. It has for me. And so I do think it's extremely unfortunate that, and damaging in the words used. I think it is damaging because we're not giving people what's actually there. If we're the ones doing the teaching, or if we're studying it for ourselves, we're not getting all it has to offer. Instead, we're often kind of importing our own understanding, and that doesn't get us very far, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're often miss out on our understanding of what we are called to be, what is our role in the kingdom. And our orientation is more towards, okay, what can God do for me in my life?
Right. Yeah.
And we get things backwards. So.
Yeah.
At any rate, you have mentioned something to the effect of that you spent more time on royal sonship than the notion of us as living statuettes. And that's because there's less scholarship on the royal sonship. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. When I did the research, there were a few people who mentioned it here and there, but overall, in the secondary literature, what scholars really focus on is this royal representative view. And it was so well known and well treated in scholarship that I thought, okay, I don't need to say a whole lot about it. And why is it that the sonship piece there was so little attention given to? I don't know why so little attention was given to that, and why consistently the secondary literature traces sonship back to Exodus. It's very prominent in Exodus, and it's very explicit there that Israel, the nation of Israel, was kind of defined as God's son. But again, I do think it goes all the way back to Genesis. So as to why it wasn't treated, I don't know. Perhaps it couldn't be because we didn't have the ancient Eastern information, because we did have it at that point. So, but it's been neglected, and it's primarily image and likeness has primarily been discussed in terms of function. But I was at a conference once on image and likeness in Genesis, and someone asked a question during the Q&A, and he said he had a niece who was severely handicapped to the point where she couldn't speak. There's no way she could function as a royal representative. She can't rule, she can't subdue. And he said to the speakers, is she still made in God's image? And they were backpedaling pretty quickly because they had defined it only in terms of function. And that's why I think the sonship piece is so important, because it's defining our identity, defining us ontologically, right? Like, who are we? Who am I? Who are we? We were created for a relationship with our Heavenly Father, first and foremost. I mean, that's how the Bible begins, defining and with creation and defining this divine human relationship in terms of kinship. And so I do think that's of primary importance. And I wanted to say to that man, she absolutely is made in God's image simply by the fact that God created her. Because it's not, ideally, yes, and generally speaking, yes, human beings are to rule and subdue. But for those who physically or mentally cannot do that, they are still made in God's image, even though they can't function as that, perhaps.
And back to the ancient Near East, though there may have been some exceptions, it sounds like for most of them, the notion was that the king was made in the image of God, whereas in Genesis, the stress is on all of humanity. So maybe the exception would be Egyptian texts you mentioned, where humanity was made in the image of God. But why is that crucial to see all humanity as opposed to just the king?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is the case that this kind of description was typically, when we find it in the ancient Eastern records, especially Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian records, that this was a relationship reserved for the king. But the fact that Genesis democratizes it to all of humanity doesn't diminish it. Instead, it actually raises all of humanity to this level of royalty and of royal sonship in relation to the God, the creator king. And so it really imbues every human being with incredible worth and dignity. They are being defined as part of God's family. Yeah. So it wasn't just reserved for the king in ancient Israel. It was all of, and it wasn't just for ancient Israel either. It was all of humanity. Is defined this way.
Yeah, I guess it says a lot about how we do things politically, whether in the wider world and especially in the church.
For sure. Yeah.
So I heard you say something before about how we respond to suffering has everything to do with the image of God.
Yes. Where did I say that?
Yeah. I can't remember.
Yeah, I do think that the way we respond to suffering is an opportunity to bear out a great opportunity to bear out what it means to be made in God's image. And it's easy to become bitter but I do think that in terms of an opportunity to bear, whether it's you suffering or someone else, it's obvious if someone else is suffering that you are, family or friends, there are ways to care for that person that demonstrate to them the care of God's care. But in terms of if you were the one suffering, like, how do I bear out the image of God? I mean, it's a great opportunity for others to see through how you respond to suffering, what it means to be created in God's image. What do I mean by that? So I knew someone who had been diagnosed with breast cancer and was just suffering terribly from that and from the treatment. And she began to keep a journal that she shared with certain people and her responses to her suffering. She wasn't angry with God. She wasn't questioning why me, but it really was a means by which or through which she came to know Christ more dearly and more closely. And so I would hope, I don't mean that to sound insensitive to anyone. I mean, there have been times probably where most of us have asked why me or been angry with God for something that happened. And the Psalms are full of people expressing those kinds of emotions to God. And I think that's certainly okay. But I was so struck by her particular responses and to witness. So I got to witness her drawing closer to God through her suffering. And it was the deepening of this parent-child, heavenly father, spiritual daughter relationship. So that's just one of the ways, but as we talked about before, when we were talking about Leviticus 19, caring for people, promoting justice, fairness, equity, there are just innumerable ways that we can live this out every day. There really are innumerable applications.
So it's interesting to me to see how the notion of being created in the image of God gives people cause or reason to value human life, whether it's in discussions about war, slavery, genocide, or someone who's suicidal or involved in, some sort of abusive, drug addiction or something. What could you say about that? How that gets to be used? And I'm thinking of the greater culture and not just the church.
I do think if we have a deeper grasp of what Genesis 1 is talking about, what it actually means to be created in God's image, the dignity that gives us, the worth that God gives us. It's not, I'm not giving it, that God declares. That's transformative if we really grab hold of that. And I do think, I remember talking years and years ago with a fellow student when I was a graduate student who was studying counseling. I said, I think that this will have bearing on your counseling practice in the future. That if people can come to really understand what it means that God defines us as his family members and as his beloved children. I mean, again, a lot of people's family relationships are very dysfunctional and perhaps, in some context, abusive. And so the metaphor of family can be a tough one for some folks. But, we can look at scripture and see what kind of father God is in the Old Testament, as well as in the New through Christ. And so I do think, again, practical and transformative implications if we can grab hold of what this actually means and how it should shape our understanding and view of ourselves. I really can't think of anything more powerful in terms of giving us kind of a reality check on who we are and who we're not. Maybe Job. Also, Job gives us a good, at the end, Job realizes I'm small and I'm not God and you are God, and I'm going to trust you despite my painful circumstances. But it is, again, I just can't think of anything more significant and more personally transforming in terms of understanding our identity, our purpose, than knowing what it means to be created in God's image, how God designed us to be in relationship with him.
Along those same lines, people often use the phrase something like, I believe life is sacred. But to my knowledge, I don't know any references in the Bible where you have that kind of language. But it sounds like they're just saying the same thing, finding two different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, the penalties for murder, they don't say in those terms life is sacred, but they do. That's the implication, right? That life is sacred. You're not to take someone else's life.
All right. And finally, you talked about wanting to write more on this topic. What do you want to dive into? What more research? What areas are you looking at covering?
Well, I'd really like to take the book is, it was my dissertation. So it's not that easily accessible to a lot of folks. So I'd really like to do something that is going to be more appealing and make these ideas much more accessible to lay folks, so that they have access to this kind of information if they want it. It's not just something for scholars. So that's something I want to be working on in the near future.
And particular areas that you haven't thoroughly researched yet, what would those be within that writing project?
Yeah, I would like to do a little more on how the church has understood these terms in Genesis 1. So delve a little more into the background, and just look at many more examples. I've only done that in kind of broad strokes so far. And I really do want to write on the practical implications of all of this as well. Now, why does this matter to me? Why should this matter to me? Kind of thing.
All right. Excellent. Good stuff. All righty. Well, we've been with Dr. Carmen McDowell, professor of Old Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. We've been looking at the image of God. So, Dr. McDowell, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right. Peace to everyone.